Within the next year, the Switch's successor will be released, and all of us are curious as to whether Nintendo will be able to maintain the runaway success of their hybrid console. But it also leads to another question. How exactly will third parties support it? Will there be original games taking advantage of the new specs, ports not possible before, or sequels to long-dormant franchises waiting for a new chance to soar? Well, what better way to peer into the future than by looking at the past? And while there are a lot of third parties that support Nintendo, I wanted to look at one of the most prominent, Capcom. Since their establishment in 1983, Capcom has taken part in 7 console generations, which means there are plenty of opportunities to see how they handle the launch of a new system. While I'm uncertain as to whether this provides any firm pattern that Capcom may follow for the Switch's follow-up, I do think it paints a solid picture of what fans could expect. So join me as I take a quick look at the first game they released on every prominent handheld and console since the very beginning. Now, rather than go through all these games chronologically, I think it makes much more sense to look at their launch titles in terms of categories, because in creating this list, I discovered a certain pattern amongst Capcom that can be broken down in 5 different ways, and we're going to go through each of them one by one. The first of which is not supporting the console at all, and this has happened 4 times over the course of these 7 generations, at least amongst the major consoles. And Capcom ultimately ended up not supporting in any way the Sega Master System, the TurboGrafx-16, the Game Gear, and the Neo Geo. At no point through the entire lifespan of these consoles did Capcom release a single game for them. And at least in the case of the Neo Geo, that makes sense, as the Neo Geo was primarily a way to port SNK games to a home console market and keep them arcade perfect. And considering SNK and Capcom were rivals at the time, it makes sense that Capcom wouldn't want any of their arcade games on Neo Geo hardware. Whether that's the actual reason, I don't really know, but that seems the most likely option. The second category of Capcom launch games are the ones that got one game from Capcom, and a low-effort one at that. And 3 consoles got this treatment, the first of which was the 3DO, and all it got was a mahjong game called Ide Yosuke Meijin no Shinmai Sen Mahjong, which featured the professional mahjong player Ide Yosuke, and is a game that has appeared on multiple systems. It's low effort, it's mahjong, not really much to expect out of that one. Next up is the WonderSwan Color, a handheld device that was exclusive to Japan, but did serve as the basis for a lot of remakes that we saw in the future. The version of Final Fantasy 1 and 2 that ended up on the Game Boy Advance are further enhanced versions of what was already available on the WonderSwan Color. However, in this case, it's a reverse situation, as Rockman.exe N1 Battle is a watered-down version of Mega Man Battle Chip Challenge, and there are quite a few differences, the biggest of which being that there is no character select screen, only Neto's story is available. There are also only 20 NetNavis instead of 49, and there are generally just less options for the game. So it makes sense that this game was never brought to the States because 1, the WonderSwan Color was not available, and 2, we already had a better version of it. The final game in this category is for the N-Gage, which, yes, did get a Capcom title, and no, is not any that you'd expect. Capcom's one and only game for the Nokia N-Gage was Catan, as in Settlers of Catan, and it's pretty much what you'd expect from a Settlers of Catan game. Now granted, Capcom didn't actually develop this game, that was done by ThinkArts. However, Capcom was the publisher, so in this case I'm going to count it. Granted, it's nothing great or spectacular, but it does fall into this category of a kind of low-effort release to see how the console shakes out. And in all 3 cases, it seems like Capcom mostly decided to stay away. Okay, those are the sad categories. From here on out, Capcom actually supported all of these consoles pretty regularly, and it's fascinating to see what game they decided to put out first. And the next category I wanted to break down are the arcade ports, and this begins as soon as the NES. Their first console game ever was 1942, which went on to sell 1 million copies for the console and was Capcom's biggest hit, eclipsing the previous arcade successes of Vulgus, Sun, and Pirate Ship Higemaru. It's also the first Capcom game to spawn sequels, something they become very good at very quickly. But yes, 1942 was their first game for the NES, and it's a pretty solid port of the arcade original. In fact, it's kind of an odd game because you play as an American pilot against the Japanese around the Battle of Midway, because this game was designed specifically with the Western market in mind. And yet it still did well in Japan, despite the fact that you were playing Americans fighting Japanese soldiers. It's an odd thing when you think about it that way, but it was their first success. Next up would be the Super Nintendo and its first game from Capcom, Final Fight. The seminal beat-em-up was incredibly popular, though the Super Nintendo version was missing a lot of content that ultimately makes it inferior to the arcade original. The biggest of which is the lack of multiplayer and the exclusion of one of the characters, Guy. You could only play as Hagar or Cody. Now, there was a version later sold in Japan and only available through Blockbuster in the States called Final Fight Guy, which replaced Cody with Guy and changed up the story slightly to explain that difference. But otherwise, they're the exact same game, which means they're missing one of the levels, lacks some of the transitions, and is generally a weaker port than the arcade original, but it's still considered a lot of fun and reviewed quite well despite its shortcomings. Next up is the Neo Geo Pocket Color, a handheld device from SNK that Capcom ultimately did support, and it could technically fall in line with the previous category because this is the only game Capcom supported that system with. However, Mega Man Battle & Fighters is also a pseudo-port of the two arcade fighting games that Mega Man received, the Power Battle and the Power Fighters. It combines elements of both into a handheld version, with obvious cuts along the way. Despite that, the game did review relatively well, though it was generally mixed. Many found the animations and design quite good, but it's still a watered-down version of arcade ports that people generally prefer. However, incredibly, this is no longer lost media or exclusive to Japan. It was eventually released in the West for the Switch and PC, meaning that American players could actually try out this often forgotten game. It's not exactly a major release, but it's still pretty cool that it's there. When it came time for the release of the Dreamcast, Capcom ultimately decided that their first game was going to be Power Stone, which of course had naturally started in the arcade, but it is generally more associated with the Dreamcast simply because of its 4-player arena action. It's certainly one of the more beloved Capcom titles out there, and many people are still hoping for either a new game or at least ports of this and its sequel to the modern consoles. But as it stands, it's an excellent example of Capcom supporting a new console through their arcade releases and outshining them in many ways. The final two titles in this category only technically fit, but I decided to ultimately include them because it just seemed like the best fit. And when it came to the PlayStation Portable, Capcom decided to port Darkstalkers Chronicle: The Chaos Tower to the handheld system. However, like I said, it's only a technicality because while it is of course based on arcade games, it's directly ported from a Japanese-only Dreamcast game called Vampire Chronicle for Matching Service, which was a version of the game that allowed players to choose their fighting style from across all 5 of the Darkstalkers arcade games. The Chaos Tower kept this idea and included the complete soundtracks from all the games as well as all the endings and moves, meaning that it's a pretty packed port and reviewed pretty favorably. However, it was on the PSP, and as it unfortunately tends to go with Darkstalkers, tended to get overlooked. Likewise, for the PlayStation Vita, Capcom went to their arcade roots, though again, this isn't exactly based on an arcade version, as it's a port of Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3. And there's not a whole lot to say about this one. It's Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 on a handheld. Cool at the time, but nowadays not something you'd ultimately go back to, and certainly nothing original. You're generally better off focusing on the console original. Still, it's pretty cool that they got it working on the Vita at the time, though again, the Vita didn't exactly have the healthiest life. The next category is perhaps the most interesting because it's all the original games that Capcom released for a new console at the time, and it all begins on the Game Boy with Gargoyle's Quest. This is a spin-off of Ghosts and Goblins and was specifically chosen for the Game Boy because they didn't want to mess with Ghosts and Goblins' success on the consoles, so they decided to take the character of Firebrand, put him in his own game, and give it a pseudo-Metroidvania feel where there's towns and a world map to explore in an overhead view, while all the actual action stages take place in 2D, and the character of Firebrand can even upgrade himself throughout the course of the game. It's a pretty solid title and even led to its own trilogy, as Gargoyle's Quest 2 came out for the NES, and then there was Demon's Crest for the Super Nintendo, all considered pretty solid games. The next is pretty much a duo, as both the Nintendo 64 and the Game Boy Color got the same game as their first title from Capcom, Magical Tetris Challenge, and they're actually pretty different, as they each feature unique modes that are exclusive to that version. Obviously, the Nintendo 64 version has a greater focus on multiplayer, but both also came with its own story mode, though they had different names as it was called Quest Mode for the Game Boy Color. There is also different puzzles, different Tetramino variations, and generally a lot of variety for a Tetris game tied in with Mickey Mouse and friends. However, perhaps the most interesting part of Magical Tetris Challenge is who directed it, and that would be Hidemaru Fujibayashi, who would go on to direct The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. There are a lot of other Zelda games under his belt as well, as he would go on to join Flagship, but this is the start of his directing career. The next game was a little harder to place, because I wasn't sure whether to place it as an original game or count it as an enhanced port. And ultimately, I decided on an original game because compared to the other enhanced ports, there is a lot more effort put into this one. And that is Resident Evil Remake. This is a complete from-the-ground-up remake of the original Resident Evil with better graphics, better voice acting, and new features to boot. It is considered the best version of Resident Evil, and its graphics still hold up to this day and is generally considered good. It's saying something that Resident Evil 2, 3, 4 are getting these remakes, and a lot of people look at this Resident Evil remake and think we don't want another remake of this one when there's so many other Resident Evils that need it more. And that certainly says something to this one's quality. It's a heck of a first impression to make, especially as it came about due to a specific deal between Capcom and Nintendo. So there's a lot of history with this one. Next up is the Game Boy Advance, and the very first Capcom game for that system was Mega Man Battle Network, which of course would go on to be highly associated with the system, and serves as a reimagining of the Mega Man story where instead of a robot, he's a network Navi that navigates the internet and fights other net Navis that go rogue. It makes for a fresh entry point and served to get a lot of people into Mega Man to the point that the Battle Network Legacy Collection is one of the best-selling Mega Man titles out there. So there's a lot of love here, and I believe getting in on the ground floor with the Game Boy Advance and being one of its first games, especially a launch game, really helped this series and put it and the system in the same category in their minds. The PlayStation 3 would also get an original game from Capcom, as their first game ended up being Devil May Cry 4. Now granted, this also released on the Xbox 360 at the same time, but as we'll see, that is a pretty common occurrence as we go along, where the same game releases on the two different consoles at the same time because, well, it just makes sense. They're trying to reach as wide of an audience as possible. And Devil May Cry 4 ended up being a pretty great game. It introduces the character of Nero, also features Dante, and while its campaign may be a little uneven, it still featured the high-quality action that the series has been known for, showing that the rebound from Devil May Cry 3 wasn't just a fluke. So yeah, all around, a pretty great title to start on the PlayStation 3. The final game to talk about actually served as the first game on two systems, the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One, and it was actually a digital-only release, Strider, from 2014. And this is a fantastic game from Double Helix, taking the idea of the original Strider and reimagining it into a more Metroidvania style that is one of the best around, and honestly a shame that has never been ported since. It is one of Capcom's best, and a true shame that we've not seen more of it, and just goes to show the quality that Double Helix could produce after creating Season 1 of Killer Instinct for the Xbox One. Really, Capcom, bring this one back. I kinda want it. A lot. But that does take care of this category of original games on new hardware. The next category, and it's amazing that this has to be its own category, but this is Capcom, is the first game being a Street Fighter title. There's a lot. And the first one was for the Sega Genesis with Street Fighter II Special Champion Edition. Now technically, Strider for the Genesis came out before this. However, that was neither published nor developed by Capcom. It was handled entirely by Sega in-house, even though it was based on the original Strider arcade game. But that's just how publishing works. So instead, it was Street Fighter II Special Champion Edition, which included the characters of Sagat, M. Bison, Balrog, and Vega, along with a new Hyper mode, and even pushed Sega to release a special 6-button controller so that players could properly play this version of the game. That's how popular Street Fighter II was back in the day. It influenced controllers. But even though the game didn't sell as well as Capcom hoped, as it saw fierce competition from Mortal Kombat, it did sell well enough, with 1.6 million copies. Next up would be the Sega Saturn, and while there was another game that was released on the same exact day, it was Japanese only and certainly doesn't have much of a legacy behind it, and that would be Gakko no Kawaii Uwasa Hanako-san ga Kata. That mouthful that I most likely butchered is based on an anime that became a first-person adventure game where you solve puzzles, avoid ghosts, and enjoy clips that serve as cutscenes from the anime this is based on. However, for the purposes of this category, the other game was Street Fighter the movie. Yes, the digitized graphics one that featured Raul Julia and Jean-Claude Van Damme. I had this one as a kid. It's Not great, but there is charm about it. It does play better than the arcade version, as Capcom went in and took out all the baffling inclusions that the original developer created for this game, but it's still not the ideal version of Street Fighter. Honestly, the most fun I ever had was playing through the story mode where you were stuck as Guile, and you had to make various choices that led you down different paths and fought different characters. All the while, highly compressed images showcase what you're doing. It's not great, but there is a charm to it, and it did serve as Capcom's first game for the Saturn. Of course, the PlayStation 1 had its fair share of Street Fighter as well, although its first game from Street Fighter is not one you'd expect, as it's based on Street Fighter II, the movie, the anime, and it's even just called Street Fighter II Movie. And this is even less of a game than Street Fighter the movie, as it's entirely FMV based, where the player watches footage from the original anime and tries to analyze each of the moves that the characters use. It's a baffling game outright, and I had never heard about this before. So I'm also going to include the game that came out a week later for the PlayStation 1 and served as Capcom's second game on the system, the original Street Fighter Alpha. And there's not a whole lot to say about this one because it's generally considered a pretty good arcade port that lost little of what the original had. So there you go, PlayStation 1, 2 Street Fighter games for the price of one. Kinda. Next up would be the PlayStation 2, where its first game was also Street Fighter. However, not one based on any of the arcade games. It was actually the third in the Street Fighter EX series, which were designed from the ground up for consoles and featured 3D models. They're somewhat fondly remembered today, but this was a fighting game from Eureka and featured the fan favorite of Skullomania. However, gameplay-wise, where it stood out from the previous games was in its new tag features, where players could switch between two characters and offer a greater combination of ways they came in a manner similar to Tekken Tag Tournament. It was also possible to have 2v2 and 1v3 battles, so while the game isn't exactly well remembered, those who have played it have a certain fondness for the game. When it came time for the Xbox 360, Capcom decided to keep it low-key for their first title and made it exclusive to the Xbox Live Arcade. And that would be Street Fighter II Hyper Fighting, which is actually the third game in the Street Fighter II sub-series that was released immediately after Champion Edition. While at this point the new characters of T-Hawk, Cammy, Fei Long, and DJ were not introduced, it did have several other changes, including a further increased game speed, some new special moves for all the characters, and new color palettes. In terms of the Xbox 360 version, an online versus mode was included, and that was certainly novel at the time, though it isn't exactly the most feature-rich Street Fighter II release ever. Amusingly, this did come out the same day as one other game from Capcom that actually goes into a different category, the originals, as Dead Rising came out for the system as well, and that got a lot more attention and even kickstarted a brand new franchise for Capcom, and is just generally considered a good time and certainly showed off what the new console could do with all the zombies on screen. So yeah, technically Xbox 360 goes in both the new game category and the Street Fighter category because Capcom decided to just double up. Perhaps infamously, as Street Fighter IV was all the rage at the time, the very first game from Capcom on the 3DS was Super Street Fighter IV 3D Edition, which was basically just an impressive port of that game onto the 3DS. And while there wasn't a ton of new features, it did feature 3D, though this had the effect of cutting the frame rate in half, from 60 to 30. There was also the new dynamic view mode that allowed the player to see over the shoulder of their chosen fighter. Perhaps more notable was the use of the touchscreen, as there was a light configuration that allowed players to simply tap on the touchscreen in order to use special moves, super combos, and ultra combos with little issue. But otherwise, this is a pretty faithful port of the console version, and sold pretty well as it hit over 1 million units as of 2011. The final Street Fighter game that served as Capcom's first title on a new console was for the Nintendo Switch, with Ultra Street Fighter II: The Final Challengers. And this one's pretty famous as Capcom didn't seem to have a lot of faith in the Switch after what happened with the Wii U. However, Ultra Street Fighter II ended up being a massive success and encouraged them to put more effort into Nintendo's new console. And Ultra Street Fighter II could be considered the ultimate version of the game, even though it is still exclusive to the Nintendo Switch. As for its features, it takes its new style graphics from HD Remix, which was released years before, and also features a classic mode to enjoy the original sprite. There's also the buddy battle that allows two players to face a computer opponent together, and most famously, it featured 2 new characters, Evil Ryu and Violent Ken. Capcom did try to add something completely new that had nothing to do with the original Street Fighter II, and that would be the Way of the Hado, which is a first-person shooting gallery where you take control of Ryu and fire off Hadokens and other special moves with the Joy-Con controllers. It's certainly something, and nobody really enjoyed it. But those are all the Street Fighter titles that served as the first game for a new console. And that leads us to our final category from Capcom, which are the enhanced ports. Basically games that came out on other systems, and then a new system came out, and they decided to update one of their older games in order to have a more feature-rich version released for another console. And that certainly was the case for the original Xbox, as Capcom's first game was Genma Onimusha. Onimusha had proven to be a solid hit for Capcom for the PlayStation 2, so it made sense to bring it over to the Xbox to try to get as many new players as possible. Overall, there's not a ton of changes, mostly better graphics, a few gameplay additions and tweaks to make it a little bit more difficult, and new 5.1 Dolby Digital audio. There's no new weapons and there's no changes to the story, but it's still considered the better version of the game. Next up would be the first game from Capcom on the Nintendo DS, Mega Man Battle Network 5 Double Team DS, an enhanced version that combined both versions of Mega Man Battle Network 5 and popped it onto the DS. It's more of a collection than anything else, as the games haven't been combined in any real way, but it does have some new features, such as redone music, a new animated opening sequence, some limited voice acting, and a few changes overall. It's basically the same game, but now both versions are available. A little bit more exciting in terms of enhanced ports is Capcom's first game for the Wii, Resident Evil 4 Wii Edition, which is still upheld as one of the best ports ever created, simply because of how much the game got enhanced thanks to the Wii Remote. It was able to maintain the same level of detail of the original GameCube while adding in all the extra features from the PlayStation 2 version, as well as better aiming thanks to the Wii Remote's pointer. It's genuinely considered the best version of the game, and really a brilliant inclusion for how to make use of the Wii Remote for existing games. As someone who picked it up immediately, it was definitely worth the purchase. The Wii U also saw an enhanced port from Capcom as their first game, this time being Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate, which also came out on the 3DS. And the game is certainly a fan favorite, as it offered a ton of new features and was genuinely considered one of the best reasons to own a Wii U early on in its life cycle. I've never really played a Monster Hunter game in my life, but I remember hearing about this game constantly on the Wii U, and this felt like when it was really starting to blow up, whether it was with the Wii original or most certainly with this Wii U version along with the 3DS version. So this game can be seen as the beginning of the Western market's acceptance of the Monster Hunter brand, and it's hard not to see why with all these raving reviews. Finally, there's this Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5's first Capcom game, Devil May Cry 5 Special Edition. Much like the others, it's Devil May Cry 5 with a few enhancements, most notably the ability to play as Virgil. And it's Devil May Cry 5, one of my favorites in the entire series, and it's a fantastic game, just made all that much better. It was also one of the most recent games put on the previous console, so it made sense for Capcom to just port it over. And that is every single first game Capcom has released on every major console. And based off creating this list and looking at these games, I think I have a good idea of what Capcom is going to put first on the Switch 2. And that is Street Fighter 6, especially because it ticks two boxes in Capcom's most used categories, namely being a Street Fighter game and being an enhanced port. Now granted, it wouldn't be graphically enhanced in any major way, hopefully just maintaining the same level of quality. However, we could expect to see all the DLC and perhaps a few other additions for the Switch Successor's version. It would make sense to include those characters and maybe even offer up a re-release that would hit the other consoles as well. A Super Street Fighter 6 as it happens, and the Switch version could even get Nintendo exclusive items for your avatar, so you can run around in a Mario outfit, or as Bowser, or as any other crazy examples that we've seen from the avatars that would work out for its story mode. But that's just my prediction after looking at all of this. It could easily be something else, it could be an original game, it could be another port, it could be any number of things, but based on prior history, this seems the most likely option to me. But what do all of you think? Let us know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to Good Vibes Gaming, hitting the like button, and ringing that bell. We also have a Patreon at patreon.com/gvgaming with plenty of extra perks. Until next time, bye!